Close your eyes for a moment. I want you to come somewhere with me, somewhere the air itself does not want you to breathe. It is the last hour before dawn in the deep swamp country of central Mississippi in the fall of the year 1838. The moon has gone down. The stars are hidden behind a wet, low cloud that has been sitting on the land for 2 days. The cypress trees rise up around you like the ribs of some drowned animal, and the black water at their feet is so still that when a single leaf falls from a branch 50 feet above, you hear it touch the surface a full second before it lands. Somewhere, far off through those trees, a man is screaming. He is a grown man, a white man, a man who yesterday morning stood on the porch of a plantation house with a glass of whiskey in his hand and a rifle over his arm, laughing with 4 of his neighbors about the sport they were about to have. And now, in this hour before dawn, in a swamp he thought he knew, that same man is screaming a sound that does not belong in the throat of a grown human being. It is not a word. It is not a name. It is the raw animal noise a person makes when the world they thought they understood has quietly turned around in the dark and begun to hunt them back. There were 5 of them 36 hours ago. 5 men on horseback with 3 rifles, 4 pistols, and 11 trained dogs between them. 5 men who had ridden out from a plantation called Live Oak on the west bank of the Pearl River at 9 o'clock in the morning of an October Tuesday in the year of our Lord 1838 for what they were pleased to call a hunt. They had given their quarry 1 hour. 1 hour to run, to disappear into the trees, to make it, as they said, sporting. They had timed it on a gold pocket watch that belonged to the eldest of them, a man named Colonel Ambrose Whitfield, who had stood on the front steps of Live Oak and looked down at the small, tired 37-year-old woman standing barefoot in the yard and had said in a voice as easy as if he were discussing the weather, "You have from 9 o'clock till 10, girl. After 10 we come for you. Go on now. Run." She did not answer him. She did not beg. She did not, as far as any of the 5 men on the porch could see, so much as look at him. She simply turned her head toward the tree line at the edge of the north field, the line of cypress and gum and water oak where the plantation ground began to soften into swamp, and she walked toward it. Not ran. Walked. The way a person walks toward a room they have been told to enter. And by the time the second day's sun was going down over those same cypress trees, 3 of those 5 men would be dead. 1 would be lost so deep in the swamp that he would not be found for 11 days. And the 5th, Colonel Ambrose Whitfield himself, would be crawling on his hands and knees through black water up to his elbows, weeping like a child, calling out into the dark for the woman he had told to run. Her name was Ruth Ellen. She could not read. She could not write. She had never in her life traveled more than 9 miles from the cabin she had been born in. She was 37 years old, and she stood in stockinged feet at 5 feet and 2 inches tall, and she weighed, by the plantation ledger of that same October, 118 pounds. In the eyes of the state of Mississippi, in the eyes of the 5 men on that porch, and in the eyes of the law under which she had lived every single day of her life, she was not a woman. She was not a person. She was a line in a book, a number, a piece of property valued in the ledger at $650. But before those 2 days were over, before the swamp gave back what was left of the men who had ridden into it, every one of those 5 men would learn a thing about her that no ledger in Mississippi had ever bothered to write down. They would learn that she had been listening her whole life to every sound that swamp made to every animal that moved through it, to every old man in her quarters who had ever, in the long quiet of a summer evening, told a story about which root was safe to eat and which was not, and which water was fit to drink and which was death, and which way the moss grew on which side of which tree, and which sound in the night was the alligator sliding into the water, and which was only the wind moving in the cane. They would learn that a person you have decided is not a person has been paying attention to a world you never bothered to see. And they would learn, the ones of them who lived long enough to learn anything at all, that the hardest, cruelest, most well-armed hunt is nothing at all against a woman who has already, in her own quiet way, made her peace with dying, and has decided that if she is going to die today, she is not going to die alone. Sit down. Turn out the lights if you can. And before we go any further into the dark of this story with her, I want you to do two small things for me. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. What city, what country, what time it is on your clock right now as this story begins. Because in the hour we are about to spend together, in this Mississippi swamp in October of 1838, I want to know exactly who is walking beside me in the dark. And when you have written that down, stay. Because her name was Ruth Ellen. And by the end of tonight, you will understand why, 188 years later, that name still deserves to be spoken out loud. To understand what happened in the swamp, you have to understand the woman who walked into it. And to understand the woman, you have to go back, long before the porch and the pocket watch and the 5 men with their dogs, to a small board cabin behind a big house on the west bank of the Pearl River on a summer night in the year 1801. That was the night she was born. There was no doctor. There was no midwife who had been sent for. There was only an older woman named Sally, who had helped bring 19 children into the world in that same cabin, and a young mother named Hagar, who was 17 years old and who, before the sun came up, would have a daughter laid on her chest, wrapped in a piece of cloth cut from an old flour sack. They did not name her that first night. In the world of a Mississippi cotton plantation in 1801, you did not name a child on the first night. You waited to see if the child was going to stay. Too many did not. In the ledger of Live Oak Plantation for the year 1801, kept in the same neat brown ink that the plantation used for the birth of horses and the arrival of new plows, there is an entry that reads simply in that summer's column, "Female child born to Hagar, living." Nothing else. Not a name, not a date. Just those 5 words. 3 days later, when it seemed the baby was going to live, Hagar named her. She gave her 2 names, one from the Bible and one from her own mother, because that was what her people had always done, and because 2 names, when you are born property, feel like 2 small pieces of armor. She named the child Ruth from the Book of Ruth, where the woman follows her mother-in-law into a strange country and says, "Whither thou goest, I will go." And she named her Ellen, after Hagar's own mother, who had been taken off a ship at Savannah in 1780 and had never been permitted in the rest of her life to say her African name out loud to another human being. Ruth Ellen. I want you to say that name once, in your head, before we go any further. And I want you to write it in the comments, along with your own name, because a story like this deserves, before anything else, to have its dead spoken by the living. Tell me your name. Tell me hers. That is how we begin. Live Oak Plantation was, in 1801, a middling place. It was not one of the great cotton empires of the state. It was 700 acres of cleared land on a low ridge above the west bank of the Pearl, with another 400 acres of uncleared bottomland running down to the river, and beyond that the wide, wet, uncrossable country of cypress and gum and standing black water that the local white families called, in a phrase that meant more than they realized, the back of nowhere. The plantation was owned, in the year Ruth Ellen was born, by a man named Josiah Whitfield, who had come out of South Carolina in the 1790s with 12 enslaved people and a wagon, and who had, by the year of his death in 1824, expanded that number to 61. Josiah's oldest son, Ambrose, had inherited the place, and by the fall of 1838, by the morning of the porch and the pocket watch, Ambrose Whitfield was 52 years old, was called Colonel by everyone in the county, though he had never served a day in any army, and owned, on paper, 89 human beings. One of whom was the woman we are talking about tonight. She grew up, as all the Live Oak children grew up, half in the yard behind her mother's cabin and half in the kitchen of the big house. Her mother, Hagar, was one of the two cooks. Her father was a man named Samuel, who worked the field, but who had, before he came to Live Oak, spent 9 years as a boatman on the Pearl River, and who knew that country of water and cypress the way a farmer knows his own field. Samuel was the man who, years before Ruth Ellen would ever have any use for it, first began, on Sunday afternoons in the yard behind the cabin, to teach his daughter the things his own father had taught him. He taught her which side of a cypress the moss grew thickest on, and how, in that country of standing water and no clear sky, the moss was more reliable than the stars. He taught her the difference between the water that would give you a bellyache and the water that would kill you outright, the shallow, stagnant pools that looked clean but weren't, and the deeper flowing channels beneath the cane that looked black and dead but were safe. He taught her which roots, when you dug them out of the mud and washed them, could keep a person alive for a week: the arrowhead, the cattail, the swamp lily, and which berries, which looked exactly like food, would empty out a grown man in an hour. He taught her the sound the alligator makes when he is sliding into the water, so that you would never mistake it for the sound of the wind. He taught her which snakes were only afraid of you and which were looking for you. He did not teach her these things because he thought she would ever need them. He taught them the way any parent teaches a child what they themselves happen to know, because the child is small and beside them in the yard, and because it feels, in the moment, like love. But something else was happening in that yard behind that cabin in the years when Ruth Ellen was growing up. And it is the thing that matters most for the story I am telling you tonight. She was listening. She was one of those children, you have known one or two of them in your own life, who did not talk much, who watched, who took a whole afternoon of a grown man's talking and folded it up inside herself the way you might fold a letter, small and small and small, and put it away in a pocket and carry it. By the time she was 10 years old, the older enslaved men on Live Oak had a joke about it. They said Ruth Ellen was born quiet because when the Lord went to hand out talking, she had been out back listening to a squirrel. The joke was affectionate. It was also, in its own way, true. She heard things other people did not hear. She noticed things other people did not notice. When she was 12 years old, she walked into her mother's cabin one evening and said, without preamble, "The old dog under the porch is going to die tonight." Her mother told her to hush. The old dog was fine. The old dog had been fine that morning. The old dog was, at that moment, lying under the porch as it had lain under the porch every evening for 8 years. The old dog was dead by sunrise. Hagar looked at her daughter across the breakfast fire the next morning, and she did not say anything. But from that day forward, when Ruth Ellen said a thing about the world outside the cabin, about the weather, about the animals, about which of the field hands was sickening, Hagar listened. That is who she was. Not a prophet, not a woman of visions the way some of the older women in the quarters were. Just a person who paid attention. In a world that had decided she was not a person, she had made herself, quietly, into the most attentive human being for 9 miles in any direction. She married, in 1821, a man named Elias. He was 3 years older than she was. He was a field hand at Live Oak, a tall, thin, gentle man who, when he asked her to jump the broom with him, did it in the yard behind Hagar's cabin on a Sunday evening in front of her mother and her father and old Sally, who had helped bring her into the world, and did it with a piece of cornbread in his hand because he had, in his shyness, forgotten to bring a proper gift. She said yes. They had a small ceremony that the plantation acknowledged in the same way plantations acknowledged such things, which was to say, not at all, in any way that would have mattered if either of them had ever needed the marriage to protect the other. They had 3 children in the next 8 years. The oldest was a boy. They named him Samuel after Ruth Ellen's father. He was born in 1823. The second was a girl. They named her Sarah. She was born in 1826. The third was another boy, a small, quiet one, born in the winter of 1829 in the same cabin his mother had been born in, and they named him Isaac. I want you to hold those 3 names in your mind, because they matter for everything that comes next. Samuel, Sarah, Isaac. 3 children born into slavery on the west bank of the Pearl River in the 1820s, in a small board cabin with a mother who could not read and a father who worked the field, and a grandmother who was still, at 43, cooking in the big house kitchen. In the winter of 1833, when Ruth Ellen was 32 years old, her husband Elias was sold. He was sold because Colonel Ambrose Whitfield, who by then had inherited the plantation from his father, had run up a gambling debt in Natchez that he could not pay. He needed $900 in cash by the end of the month. He looked at his ledger of 81 human beings, and he selected 6 of them who could be sold quickly and quietly to a trader passing through. And Elias was one of the 6. There was no warning. There was no discussion. On a Wednesday morning in February of 1833, Elias was in the field. On a Wednesday afternoon, he was in a coffle chained to 5 other men, walking south toward Natchez. Ruth Ellen, working in her mother's kitchen, was told the news by a houseboy who had been sent by the overseer. She did not scream. She did not fall down. She stopped stirring the pot she had been stirring, and she said, in the same quiet voice she had used all her life, "Where?" The houseboy said, "Natchez, ma'am. Then Louisiana, they say." She nodded once. She went back to stirring the pot. She never saw her husband again. She never received a single word from him. She never learned, in the remaining years of her life, whether he had lived long or died young, whether he had been sold once or 5 times, whether he was, on any given morning of the years that followed, alive or dead. He was, in the ordinary Mississippi arithmetic of the 1830s, simply gone. 3 years later, in the summer of 1836, they sold her son. Samuel was 13 years old. He was, by the standards of the ledger, a strong boy, A boy who could bring, at the right market, $500. And the colonel, who by then had married a woman from Vicksburg who wanted a house in town as well as the plantation on the river, needed $500 for the down payment. That morning, Ruth Ellen was permitted to walk with her son as far as the north gate of the property. She did not carry a bundle for him because there was no bundle to carry. She held his hand. She did not cry. When they reached the gate and the trader was waiting there in his wagon, she stopped and she looked down at Samuel, and she said one sentence to him, only one. The houseboy who was standing at the gate to open it heard her say it, and years later, when he himself was an old free man in Vicksburg after the war, he still remembered it. She said, "Boy, wherever they take you, you keep your name. You keep it in your mouth. Don't let nobody take it. Say it to yourself every night, quiet, so you don't forget who you are." Samuel nodded. He was 13. He did not entirely understand what she was telling him, but he nodded. And the trader took him up onto the wagon, and the wagon rolled south down the road toward Jackson, and Ruth Ellen walked back to her mother's cabin, and she went back to work. 2 years after that, in the summer of 1838, 3 months before the morning of the porch, they took her second child. They took Sarah. Sarah was 12. She was a small, quiet girl, exactly the kind of girl her mother had been at the same age. She was sold to a family in Mobile, a doctor and his wife who wanted a young house girl. Ruth Ellen walked her to the gate the way she had walked Samuel. She said the same sentence. She watched the same wagon roll south. She walked back to her mother's cabin. And this time, she did not go back to work. She sat down on the floor of the cabin. She did not eat. She did not speak. She sat down at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the day her daughter was sold, and she was still sitting on that floor at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the following day. Old Sally came in and put a bowl of cornmeal in front of her. It was still there, untouched, at sunset. Hagar came in. Her mother was 54 now and moved slowly, and Hagar sat down on the floor beside her daughter, and Hagar did not say anything either. The two women sat there together on the boards until it got dark, and then they lay down where they were, and they slept side by side without eating and without speaking. And in the morning Ruth Ellen got up and went back to the kitchen. But something had come out of her in those 36 hours on the cabin floor. Something quiet. Something that everyone in the quarters noticed, and no one said out loud. She had stopped being afraid of Colonel Ambrose Whitfield. She had stopped being afraid of the overseer. She had stopped in some deep way inside her own chest, being afraid of what could still be done to her. Because everything that could be done to her, in her own reckoning of it, had already been done. Her husband was gone. Her oldest son was gone. Her daughter was gone. She had one child left in the world, Isaac, 9 years old. And the whole of her love and the whole of her fear and the whole of what was still hers to lose had narrowed down onto that one small boy. That was the summer of 1838. That was the ground on which she was standing when, in the last week of October of that same year, Colonel Ambrose Whitfield rode in from Jackson at noon with 4 other men behind him, dismounted at the front steps of Live Oak, called for whiskey to be brought out onto the porch, and, on his second glass, said aloud to his friends the sentence that would change every one of their lives. He said, "Gentlemen, I have a notion. Let us have a hunt. I want you to see the porch now, because everything turns on this porch, and I want you to see it exactly as it was. It is the front porch of the big house at Live Oak Plantation. It runs the whole width of the house, 30 feet across, floored in heart pine boards that have been polished for 40 years by the feet of the family and the mopping of the housewomen. There are 4 white columns holding up the roof of the porch. There are 2 rocking chairs on the left side of the front door and 2 rocking chairs on the right side of the front door. Between the 2 chairs on the right, there is a small round table of cherry wood, and on that table, at 9 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, October the 30th, 1838, there is a decanter of whiskey and 5 glasses. The 5 men are on the porch. Colonel Ambrose Whitfield is standing at the top step. He is 52 years old. He is a big man, thick through the chest, going gray at the temples, wearing the boots he rides in and a coat that was tailored in New Orleans 2 years ago. His pocket watch, heavy, gold, engraved with his father's initials, is in his left hand. To his right, leaning on the railing, is a man named Edward Prentice. He is 44 years old. He owns a smaller plantation 9 miles south of Live Oak. He is thin, sharp-faced, and he has been drinking since breakfast. He has, in the last 6 months, lost 2 enslaved men to runaways who were never recovered, and he has, in the same 6 months, developed a particular and personal hatred of the whole species of the runaway. Sitting in the left-hand rocking chair is a man named Reuben Kell. Reuben Kell is 38 years old. He is a slave trader by profession. He is ridden up that morning from Jackson because he had business at Live Oak and because the colonel, in the way of Mississippi hospitality, had told him at breakfast that a small entertainment was being planned for the afternoon and that he was welcome to stay. Standing beside Reuben Kell's chair, holding his own glass, is a young man named Charles Whitfield. He is the colonel's 22-year-old nephew. He has come down from Nashville the week before to spend the fall on the plantation. He has, in his short life, killed 1 deer, 3 foxes, and never in his life fired at any living thing that could look back at him. And at the far end of the porch, leaning against the last column, quieter than the rest, is a man named Silas Boone. Silas Boone is 31 years old. He is what the county calls a patroller, one of the small, poorer white men who ride the night roads on rotation, checking passes, looking for runaways, drawing a small county wage for the trouble. He has brought with him this morning 3 of the best hounds in the county, dogs bred out of the strain that had been developed on the Cuban sugar plantations in the 1820s and imported into the American South in the 1830s, specifically for the tracking of human beings. Slave Hounds and Abolition in the Americas, Perry, 2020. The other 8 dogs in the pack are the colonel's own, kept in a fenced run behind the stables. 5 men, 11 dogs, 3 rifles, 4 pistols, 1 porch, 1 decanter of whiskey, 1 gold pocket watch. And in the yard below the porch, standing barefoot on the packed dirt in a plain gray dress that had once belonged to Colonel Whitfield's late mother, is a small woman, 37 years old, whose hair is beginning to gray at the temples and whose hands at her sides are perfectly still. The colonel had sent for her 10 minutes earlier. He had sent the houseboy to Hager's kitchen, and the houseboy had told her, "Colonel says come out front, ma'am." She had come. She had, as she always did when she was called to the front of the house, wiped her hands on her apron before she left the kitchen. And when she reached the yard, she had done exactly what her mother had taught her to do when a white man was speaking, which was to stand still and keep her hands where they could be seen and not raise her eyes above the level of the man's chin. But she had, in the last 3 months, stopped being afraid. And so when the colonel began to speak to her from the top step of the porch, she did something small, something no one on that porch noticed at the time, but that one of the field boys, who was watching from behind the corner of the smokehouse, later described in his own testimony after the war, when he was an old man being interviewed by a school teacher for the local historical society. He said, "She looked at him, right in the face, not down, not to the side, right at him. And she didn't blink." The colonel did not notice. The colonel was already talking. He was, he said, going to give her the sporting chance that any man of quality gave a runaway. She had, he said, 1 hour, from 9 o'clock, when he now placed the watch open on the small cherry table for all 5 men to see, until 10 o'clock, when he would close it again. In that hour, she was free to go wherever she wished, into the fields, into the trees, into, if she chose, the back of nowhere, the swamp beyond the north fence. At 10 o'clock, he said, the hunt would begin. The 5 men would ride, the 11 dogs would follow, and whichever of them came upon her first would have the pleasure of returning her to Live Oak, alive, if possible, for a public punishment on the front lawn the following morning that would, in the colonel's phrase, make an example that the rest of the property would not soon forget. The other men on the porch laughed. Prentice laughed loudest. The young nephew Charles laughed a beat too late and a beat too high, and looked around at the others to see if he had done it right. Silas Boone did not laugh. Silas Boone was watching the woman. He was watching her, later he would say, because he had seen the eyes of a great many runaways in his life, and he had learned the difference between the eyes of the ones who were about to break and the eyes of the ones who were not. The woman in the yard, he thought, did not have the eyes of a person who was about to break. She had the eyes of a person who had already broken, a long time ago, in some other room, and had put herself back together with different pieces, and was now standing here waiting to see what the world was going to do next. The colonel finished his speech. He looked down at the yard. "Do you understand me, girl?" he said. She answered him. It was, according to the field boy behind the smokehouse, the only sentence she spoke on that porch that morning. She said, in a voice as quiet and as flat as the surface of the black water in the swamp beyond the north fence, "Yes, sir. I understand you." The colonel nodded. He picked up the watch. He held it up so the whole porch could see the face of it, and the men leaned forward. 9 o'clock, the colonel said. "You have until 10. Go on now. Run." She did not run. She turned. She walked across the yard, past the smokehouse, past the fence, past the corner of the north field, and she went, in a slow, steady, unhurried walk that no one on the porch had ever seen a runaway use in the history of Mississippi, toward the tree line, where the plantation ground began to soften into swamp. Behind her on the porch, Edward Prentice said in a voice that was, for the first time that morning, "She ain't running, Colonel." The colonel said, "She'll run when she hears the dogs." But there was, in the field boy's later testimony, a small thing that happened between those two sentences. Ruth Ellen, walking away, still in earshot of the porch, turned her head once and looked back. Not at the porch, not at the colonel. She looked deliberately and for a long moment at the run behind the stables where the dogs were kept. She looked at those dogs in their pen, the way a person might look at a room she was about to enter. Then she turned back to the tree line, and she kept walking. She reached the trees at 9 minutes past 9. She did not stop at the edge of them. She did not look back a second time. She walked into the cypress and the gum and the water oak, and within 20 steps, she was out of sight of the porch. And within 100 steps, she was in a country the 5 men on the porch had ridden past many times in their lives, but had never, any of them, actually walked into on foot. I want you to say her name now, one more time, before we follow her in. Ruth Ellen. Say it out loud if you can. Write it in the comments if you're listening on your phone. Because from the moment she walked into those trees, in the 9th minute of the 9th hour of the 30th of October, 1838, she was on her own, in the back of nowhere, with 51 minutes to do a thing that no one on that porch, no one in that county, no one in that state believed a woman like her was capable of doing. She was not going to run. She was going to prepare. Here is where the story becomes strange. Here is where, if you have ever read the small handful of accounts that survive of what happened at Live Oak in the last days of October 1838, you will find that the narratives begin, all of them, to slow down and become careful. Because what Ruth Ellen did in those 51 minutes was not any of the things that the 5 men on the porch had prepared themselves for. I am going to tell you what she did, and I am going to tell you it slowly because it matters. But I am not, yet, going to tell you why. The why of it, the reason a barefoot woman would spend the only 51 minutes she had been given not running, but doing what she did instead, will come later in this story, in a place where it will land harder than it could land here. So keep listening, and keep the question in your mind. Why did she do these things in this order? She walked into the trees for 4 minutes at the same steady pace she had used in the yard. Then she stopped. She had reached, by this point, a place perhaps 300 yards inside the tree line, where the ground began to give slightly underfoot, where the last of the plantation soil began to mix with the black, standing water of the swamp proper. There was a fallen cypress here, going soft with rot, half in the water and half on the higher ground, and there was, on the far side of that cypress, a small hollow between 2 of its buttressed roots where a person could sit and not be seen from any direction except directly overhead. She sat down in that hollow, and she took off her apron. The apron was made of coarse cotton, dyed a pale blue. It was the ordinary house apron the plantation gave to all the kitchen women, and it had been washed so many times that the blue had gone almost to white. She spread it out on the wet ground between her knees, and then, from the 2 deep pockets of the apron, the pockets that no one on the porch had noticed, that no one on the porch had thought to check, that no one on the porch had imagined a woman like her would think to fill before she walked outside, she began to take things out. She took out first a small folded square of oiled paper. She took out, second, a cotton pouch, closed with a drawstring that held a mixture of dry cornmeal and dried pork fat that she had been salting away, a spoonful at a time, from the plantation kitchen for the last 8 weeks. She took out, third, a small pewter cup that fit into the palm of her hand. She took out, fourth, a piece of flint and the small square of iron and a scrap of scorched cloth wrapped around them for tinder. She took out, fifth, a piece of folded cloth about the size of 2 handkerchiefs, dark gray in color, the same color as the mud of the swamp at that time of year. She took out, sixth and last, a small horn spoon that had belonged to her mother. She laid all 6 of these things on the apron. She looked at them for a moment. And then, in the 6th minute of her hour, she began to do the work she had walked into that swamp to do. She unfolded the oiled paper. Inside the paper were 6 small folded packets of powder, 3 brown, 2 greenish, and 1 almost white. Every one of them she had made herself over the last 3 summers, from roots and leaves that her father Samuel had once, in the yard behind the cabin, taught her to recognize on a Sunday afternoon when she was small. He had not taught her to make the powders. Her father had died in 1830 when she was 29 years old, of the same slow, wearing sickness that took so many of the field men in that country. But the knowledge of the plants themselves, of which root did what, of which leaf did what, he had planted in her when she was 7, and she had, in the quiet way that was hers, carried it and grown it, and used it in her own kitchen for 8 years to treat the small sicknesses of her own children before her children were taken. Now she opened the packets, and she began to do a thing that, if any of the 5 men on the porch of the big house had happened to see it, they would not have understood. She took the packet of the almost white powder, which was made from the ground and dried root of a plant that in that country was called mad root, and that no field hand in Mississippi in 1838 was allowed to touch. And she opened her cotton pouch of cornmeal and pork fat, and she added a careful, small pinch of the powder to the meal, and she stirred it in with the horn spoon of her mother's. Then she folded the pouch closed again. She took the packet of greenish powder next, this one made from the leaves of a plant her father had called dog's tongue, for reasons her father had never explained and that she had never asked. And she rolled the powder into a small paste with a few drops of water from the swamp at her feet. She rolled the paste into a ball the size of a walnut. She wrapped the ball in a scrap of the oiled paper. She put it in the small pouch at her waist that had, until that morning, held her sewing needle and her thimble. She took the packet of brown powder third, this one made from a root her father had taught her never, ever to put in a person's food. And she opened it, and she looked at it for a long moment, and then she put it, without adding it to anything, into the pocket of her dress. The other 3 packets she folded back into the oiled paper, and she folded the paper back into the apron, and she folded the apron into a small square, and she pushed the square down into a hollow in the fallen cypress, and she covered it with wet moss. Then she stood up, and she began to walk. She walked for the next 30 minutes in what would have appeared to any observer to be a very strange pattern. She did not walk in a straight line away from the plantation. She did not, in fact, walk in any single direction at all. She walked in a slow, deliberate figure, turning back on herself, doubling, crossing her own path, through a section of the swamp perhaps 400 yards across and 600 yards deep, north and slightly east of the point where she had entered the trees. And as she walked, she did 4 small things. The first thing was that at 3 separate places, along 3 separate small game trails that ran through the swamp, trails made by deer and by fox and by the occasional wild pig, she took a small pinch of the cornmeal and pork fat mixture out of her pouch, the mixture that now contained the pinch of mad root powder, and she placed it in a small, careful heap at a point where the trail passed through a natural bottleneck between 2 fallen logs. The second thing was that at 4 separate places, she counted them as she went, she took the small ball of greenish paste out of her waist pouch, and she broke off a piece the size of a fingernail, and she rubbed it hard into the bark of a cypress tree at about the height of a dog's nose. Then she rubbed her hand hard in the mud, and she wiped it on the ground. The third thing was that at 2 separate places, in low ground where the water was ankle deep, she took a piece of the dark gray folded cloth out of her pocket, and she pressed it into the mud of the stream bed, and she left it there, wedged under a root. And she left, on top of each piece of cloth, a small torn scrap of her own gray dress. The fourth thing was that at exactly one place in the whole of that half hour of walking, she stopped, and she knelt down, and she used her horn spoon to dig a hole in the ground the length of her forearm and the depth of her elbow. She lined the hole with the last of the dark gray cloth. She stepped down into it, and she checked its length against her own body, and she nodded once, and she climbed out, and she covered it loosely with wet leaves and a piece of the rotted cypress bark. Then she walked out of the figure she had walked in a straight line east for perhaps 200 yards until she came to a place where the swamp opened out into a slightly higher stand of pines on a low ridge. She sat down on a pine log. She took out the small pewter cup. She took a mouthful of cornmeal from a second pouch tied inside her dress against her ribs that was not the pouch she had been salting the trails with, and she chewed it slowly, and she swallowed it, and she drank one careful mouthful of clean water from a rain pool she had noticed as she walked. Then she waited. She waited for the sound of the dogs. It came at 10 minutes past 10 o'clock in the morning. First, the distant, faint, rising note of the pack in full cry, a mile behind her at the plantation. Then, moments later, the sharper sound of the horses being spurred, and the voices of the 5 men calling to one another as they rode into the north field. Ruth Ellen sat on the pine log and listened. She listened to the sound the way a cook listens to a pot that has just begun to boil. Not with fear, with judgment. With the same careful, attentive judgment she had used all her life to know when the beans were done and when the bread was ready to come out of the oven. And on the pine log in the swamp beyond the north fence of Live Oak Plantation, on the morning of the 30th of October, 1838, Ruth Ellen, 37 years old, mother of 3 children of whom 2 had been sold and 1 was still, at that very moment, playing behind Hagar's cabin 9 miles to the south, closed her eyes for one long, quiet breath. Say her name again, if you would. Out loud. Write it in the comments, because she is about to stand up off that log, and in the 51 minutes she has just spent in the swamp, she has done, in her own quiet way, 6 separate things. You do not yet know what all of them are for. Neither do the 5 men on their horses. But you are about to find out. Both of you. At the same time. The dogs found her first trail heap 41 minutes into the hunt. Silas Boone's lead hound, a dog named Rebel, 4 years old, the best tracker in the county, came upon the small heap of cornmeal and pork fat where it had been laid at the bottleneck between the 2 fallen logs on the first game trail. Rebel stopped. Rebel sniffed. Rebel, because Rebel had been trained to associate the smell of enslaved people with the smell of the food they carried in their pockets, ate the heap. Within 12 minutes, Rebel was down. He did not die at once. Madroot, which the old fieldmen in that country knew never to touch, works slowly on a dog, the way it works slowly on a man. It first steals the sense of smell, then it steals the sense of balance. Then it steals, over the course of perhaps 2 hours, the ability of the animal to know what it is doing or where it is or why it was running in the first place. Rebel began, 30 seconds after eating the heap, to stagger. Rebel began 5 minutes after that to circle. Rebel began 10 minutes after that to whine in a high, thin, confused voice that Silas Boone had never heard from any dog he had ever owned in his life. Silas Boone dismounted. Silas Boone examined the dog. Silas Boone said in a voice that had gone quiet in a way the other 4 men did not immediately understand, "Colonel, something's wrong." Colonel Ambrose Whitfield, sitting his horse 10 yards away, had by then only just begun to enjoy the day. He had not yet had time to be inconvenienced. He rode over. He looked at Rebel. He said, "Dog's overheated. Water him. Let's move on." But by the time Silas Boone had watered Rebel, the second dog in the pack, a smaller hound named Judah, had come upon the second trail heap, on a trail 300 yards to the east, and had eaten it. And by the time the fourth dog had come upon the third trail heap 400 yards to the north and eaten it, 3 of the 11 dogs were down. Silas Boone was no longer telling the colonel anything. Silas Boone was staring at the 3 staggering dogs, and Silas Boone, who had been a patroller for 9 years and who had run down 41 runaways in that time and had never once in any of those pursuits seen a dog behave the way these 3 dogs were now behaving, was for the first time in his professional life afraid. He said quietly, so that only the colonel could hear him, "This ain't a runaway, Colonel. This is something else." The colonel did not want to hear it. The colonel had 4 other men behind him and a young nephew watching him, and the colonel had already announced on his own porch that this was going to be a sporting entertainment. The colonel spurred his horse. The colonel said, "We ride!" They rode. They rode over the next 4 hours through the section of the swamp where Ruth Ellen had walked her strange figure. And the dogs, the 8 dogs that were still standing, did what dogs in a swamp will always do when they have been trained to follow a scent that is now on every tree they pass, on every wet piece of ground they cross, and on every scrap of gray cloth wedged into every root. They became, in the technical language of the hunters, confused. They ran in 4 directions at once. They doubled back on themselves. They cried at 3 separate trails as though each one were fresh. Silas Boone tried twice to call them back into a pack. They did not come. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 5 hours into the hunt, the 8 remaining dogs were spread out across a quarter of the square mile of swamp, and the 5 men on their horses were shouting to one another through the cypress and could no longer see one another for the trees. At 2:30, the young nephew, Charles Whitfield, became separated from the group. He had ridden on his own north and east, following a sound he thought was one of the dogs. It was not one of the dogs. It was the wind moving in the cane, in a way that only a person who had grown up in that swamp would have known was not a dog. By the time young Charles realized that he could no longer hear his uncle's voice, he had ridden perhaps 3/4 of a mile from the rest of the party. He turned his horse. He tried to ride back. But in a swamp, in October, when the sun is behind cloud and the moss on every tree is telling you a direction you have never been taught to read, a man on a horse can be 400 yards from his own uncle and be, in the useful sense of the word, lost. Young Charles was lost. He would not be found for 11 days. When they found him, a search party of 40 men from 3 counties working the swamp in a grid, he was alive, but he had not eaten anything in 7 days except grubs and swamp lily root, and he had, in the last 3 days, been drinking water from a pool that his uncle would later be told by an old free black man in Jackson was the kind of pool a person did not drink from. Young Charles Whitfield would live, but he would come out of the swamp not entirely the same young man who had gone in, and he would spend the rest of his life. He lived until 1889 and became a Methodist minister in Alabama, refusing to hunt any living thing, and refusing to ever again cross the state line into Mississippi. He is buried in Montgomery. His headstone has a single sentence carved beneath his name. It says, "He came out of the swamp." But that is later. That is 11 days later. What matters now is that at 2:30 in the afternoon on the first day, The hunting party had already, without knowing it, lost one man. They noticed at 4 o'clock. By 4 o'clock, 3 of the 11 dogs were dead. 3 more were staggering and useless. 2 more were missing, and only 3 of the pack were still functioning, and those 3 had not been able to hold a scent for over an hour. The 4 remaining men, the colonel, Prentice, Reuben Kell, the trader, and Silas Boone, the patroller, reined in their horses on a piece of slightly higher ground and looked at each other. And it was Reuben Kell who said what all of them were by then thinking. He said, "Where is the boy?" They shouted for Charles. For an hour, there was no answer. The colonel, who had not, until that hour, had a single serious thought about the woman he had told to run, who had assumed, on his porch that morning, that she would be dragged back by nightfall, began, for the first time, to feel a small, cold thing in his chest that he did not have a name for. He rode. He shouted his nephew's name. He fired his pistol into the air 3 times at 10-minute intervals, which was the county signal for a man in distress. No one answered the pistol either. At sunset, Silas Boone said, "Colonel, we got to camp. We can't ride this country in the dark." The colonel wanted to argue. The colonel could not argue. Silas Boone was right, and every man on that piece of higher ground knew it. In a Mississippi swamp on a moonless October night with cloud on the sky and no landmarks, a man on a horse could ride himself or his horse into a piece of water that would kill both of them in 10 minutes. They camped. They built a fire, a small, sputtering, damp fire, because in that country in October the wood does not burn well. And they sat around it, 4 men, on the higher piece of ground. And they ate what they had brought with them, which was cold biscuit and cured ham and the last of the whiskey out of Prentice's saddlebag. They tied the 3 remaining dogs to a pine. They took turns keeping watch. They did not sleep. Because at some point after full dark, none of them could later agree on exactly when, whether it was 10 o'clock or midnight or 1 in the morning, the sounds began. They were small sounds at first. A branch cracking somewhere out in the dark 30 yards from the fire. A splash in the water. Nothing you could shoot at because you could not see it. Silas Boone stood up with his rifle 3 separate times, and each time Silas Boone lowered his rifle, and each time Silas Boone sat back down. And each time Silas Boone was, in his own testimony many years later when he had left Mississippi and become a farmer in Missouri, as afraid as I have ever been in my life. And I could not have told you at any moment of that night why. Ruth Ellen was in the trees. She was not close to the fire. She was, by that hour, perhaps 60 yards away, close enough to see the fire, far enough that even in daylight none of the men would have been able to see her against the cypress. She was sitting, cross-legged, on a fallen log, with the small, dark gray cloth over her hair and shoulders, and she was, at intervals, doing 3 things. She was, at intervals, dropping a small pebble into the water at a place where the sound would carry. She was, at intervals, striking 2 pieces of dry cane together, softly, to make the small, sharp sound that in that swamp is the sound of a branch cracking. And she was, at intervals, singing. Not loudly, not in words, just humming, very low. The same 3 or 4 notes she had hummed all her life while she worked in her mother's kitchen. A tune old Sally had taught her when she was 7. A tune Hagar had taught Sally when Hagar was 7. A tune that had, somewhere in the century before that, come out of a village in Africa that no one in the Whitfield family had ever heard the name of. And it was that sound, more than anything else, more than the pebble in the water, more than the crack of the cane, that unmade the four men around the fire. Because Silas Boone could hear it. And Silas Boone did not know what it was. Silas Boone had been on plantations his whole life, but Silas Boone had never sat with the women in their kitchens, and Silas Boone had never heard a lullaby hummed by an enslaved woman rocking a baby. And Silas Boone, hearing this sound floating out of the dark of a swamp on a moonless October night, could not, for the life of him, decide whether it was a woman singing or the wind moving through a hollow tree, or something else, something older, something the swamp itself was doing to him for having ridden into it. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Edward Prentice stood up. He had been drinking steadily since sunset. He picked up his rifle. He said, "I have had enough of this," and he walked out of the ring of firelight into the dark. He did not come back. They found him 3 months later, in the winter of 1839, when a party of trappers came into that section of the swamp in the dry season. He had gone perhaps 200 yards from the fire before he had stepped into a piece of water that was deeper than he thought it was, and the mud of that piece of water had held his boot, and he had fallen forward, and he had not been able to get up. He had drowned in 8 inches of water. The trappers who found him said the strange thing about the body was that his rifle was still in his hand, and the rifle had never been fired. At sunrise on the second day, when the Colonel and Reuben Kell and Silas Boone realized that Prentice had not come back and would not come back, they held a short conversation. The Colonel wanted to keep hunting. Silas Boone wanted to ride out. Reuben Kell, who was, of the 3 of them, the only one who was not a Mississippian, and who had, since about midnight, been quietly resolving in his own head that he was never going to accept another invitation to another hunt as long as he lived, said that he was going home. He said it flatly. He said it without discussion. He said it with his hand already on his saddle horn. And then Reuben Kell mounted his horse, and he rode out alone, going south by the sun. And he made it, by nightfall of the second day, back to a road he recognized, and he never in his life set foot in Mississippi again. He would die in Ohio in 1861. In his will, he left the whole of a small fortune made in the years after 1838 in a trade he had converted from slaving to dry goods to a Methodist orphanage in Cincinnati. His will contained a single sentence in explanation, which reads in the probate records of the county to this day, "I owe a debt to a woman whose name I never learned and whose face I never saw. This is toward it." That was noon of the second day. By noon of the second day, the hunting party of 5 was down to 2 men, Colonel Ambrose Whitfield and Silas Boone. 3 men were gone. 6 dogs were dead. 2 dogs had run and would not come back. 3 dogs were staggering in circles behind them, useless. And Ruth Ellen, who had not in 36 hours been seen by any human eye except her own, was still in the swamp. The Colonel and Silas Boone rode north through the afternoon. The Colonel had gone very quiet. Silas Boone had gone quieter. At perhaps 3 o'clock in the afternoon, on a piece of ground that neither of them recognized, Silas Boone's horse stepped into the hole that Ruth Ellen had dug on the morning of the previous day. The one hole, the length of a forearm, the depth of an elbow. And the horse's front leg went into it up to the shoulder, and the horse screamed, and the horse went down. And Silas Boone, who had been leaning forward in the saddle at that moment, was thrown clear over the horse's head into a stand of cane. The horse did not get up. Its leg was broken in 3 places. Silas Boone, when he had picked himself up out of the cane and walked back to the horse, did the thing you do for a horse with a broken leg. He shot it. And the sound of that pistol shot in that swamp on that afternoon was the sound of the last hunting party at Live Oak Plantation ending. Silas Boone said to the colonel, "I am walking out, Colonel. I am walking out now. You can come with me, or you can stay." The colonel stayed. Silas Boone walked. He walked for 8 hours. He walked in the direction his mother, 20 years before, had once told him was the direction of the settled country when the moss was reading right. And Silas Boone's mother had been correct. And by 2 o'clock in the morning, Silas Boone came out of the trees onto the same road Reuben Kell had come out onto 12 hours earlier. He walked south along the road. He reached the outskirts of the little settlement of Bogue Chitto at first light of the 3rd day. He never went into the swamp again in his life. He sold his 3 surviving dogs the following month. He left Mississippi in the spring of 1840. He died in Missouri in 1867 on a small farm of a fever at 59 years of age. He never had children. His widow, when a schoolteacher came around in 1878 collecting stories for the County Historical Society, said only that her husband had once, in the fall of 1838, been on a hunt that had gone wrong, and that he had never spoken of it in 27 years of marriage, except once, on the last night of his life, when he had said to her from his sickbed a single sentence. He had said, "It wasn't the woman that beat us, Martha. It was that we thought she wasn't one." And that leaves, as you have been waiting all this while to hear about, the Colonel. Colonel Ambrose Whitfield, 52 years old, alone in the swamp on the evening of the 2nd day, on foot now because Silas Boone had gone and had taken his horse with him, and the Colonel's own horse, which had thrown him at some point in the last hour, at a sound the Colonel could not identify, had run off south through the trees and could not be caught. The Colonel was alone. The Colonel had a rifle with 1 shot left in it, because the Colonel had already fired twice at things he thought he had seen in the trees and had, both times, been wrong. The Colonel had, in the pocket of his coat, the gold pocket watch that had belonged to his father. The Colonel was, for the first time in his life, in a place where none of the things he owned, the plantation, the 89 human beings on it, the house in Vicksburg, the seat at the church, the name Whitfield that in 3 counties meant a kind of power that did not have to be explained. None of them, in the swamp on the evening of the 2nd day, meant anything at all. The sun went down. The Colonel sat down against the base of a cypress tree. He held the rifle across his knees. He did not build a fire because he did not, in that moment, want to be seen. He sat in the dark. He waited. At some point in the night, he could not later, when he would try to tell this story to a Baptist minister in Vicksburg in 1841, be sure whether it was 1 o'clock in the morning or 3 or 4, he began to hear the humming. It came from perhaps 20 yards away. It moved slowly around him, first on his left, then behind him, then on his right. It was not loud. It was not threatening. It was the same 3 or 4 notes that Silas Boone had heard the night before, and that the 4 men around the fire the night before that had heard, and that Colonel Ambrose Whitfield, sitting alone against a cypress on the 2nd night with a rifle he was afraid to fire, now recognized. He recognized it because it was the same tune he had heard all his childhood coming out of the kitchen door of the big house at Live Oak Plantation, when a small woman named Ruth Ellen, 13 years old to his 11 when they had been children together in the yard behind that house before the world had decided which of them was which, had hummed it while she washed dishes and while she peeled corn and while she rocked a baby that was not her own to sleep in a nursery upstairs. He recognized it, and he began to weep. Say her name once more before the last section. Ruth Ellen. Write it in the comments. Because at some hour of the deep night of the second day, the last of the 5 men who had ridden out of Live Oak Plantation to hunt her, the man who had held the pocket watch, and the man who had said, "Go on now, run," dropped his rifle in the mud of a Mississippi swamp and put his face in his hands and cried out into the dark the sentence that would follow him for the rest of his life. He cried out, "Ruth Ellen, I am sorry. Ruth Ellen, please, I am sorry." There was no answer. The humming stopped. He was alone. They found Colonel Ambrose Whitfield at noon on the third day. A search party of 32 men put together in the town of Bogue Chitto by Silas Boone and by the sheriff of the county had ridden into the swamp at first light, following Silas Boone's back trail. They found the colonel a mile and a half inside the tree line, on his hands and knees in black water up to his elbows, crawling, not walking, not running, crawling, in what he seemed to believe was the direction of home, but which was, in fact, the direction of the deeper swamp. He was talking to himself when they found him. He was, according to 2 of the men in the search party who later gave sworn statements to the county coroner, saying over and over again, in a voice that had gone thin and cracked from a night and a day of it, "I am sorry. I am sorry. Ruth Ellen, I am sorry." They pulled him out of the water. They put him on a horse. They took him home. Live Oak's overseer had, in the colonel's 3 days of absence, held the plantation together by main force and no small amount of shouting. The colonel's wife had come down from Vicksburg. Hagar was in the kitchen. Old Sally was in the yard. The house was, on the outside of it, running as it had always run. The colonel was put to bed in his own upstairs bedroom. A doctor was sent for. The doctor came, examined him, and said what doctors of that period always said in such cases, that the man had a fever, that the man's nerves were shocked, that the man required rest, laudanum, and quiet, and that with the grace of God, the man would recover. The man did not recover. Colonel Ambrose Whitfield lived for another 11 years. He did not, in that time, leave the property of Live Oak Plantation once. He did not, in that time, ride again. He did not, in that time, allow a dog to be kept on the place. He did not, in that time, ever sell another enslaved person from Live Oak. And he did not, in that time, ever again strike or permit to be struck any human being on the property. He also did not, in that time, ever speak the name Ruth Ellen out loud in any room of that house or on any of the porches of it to any person for the rest of his life. But he wrote it. His wife found the papers after his death in 1849. They were in the top drawer of his desk. There were 41 of them. They were dated, one at a time, from the winter of 1838 to the fall of 1849, and each one of them contained the same 3 words, written in his own hand in the middle of a blank page, with nothing else on the page around it. Each one said, in the ordinary handwriting of an ordinary man who had done a thing he could never undo, "I am sorry. His wife burned them, all 41. She burned them the day after the funeral in the parlor fireplace, without reading any of them a second time. She never spoke to any person of what they were. Ruth Ellen came back out of the swamp on the 5th day. She did not come back to Live Oak. She was not, as you have perhaps by now understood, ever going to come back to Live Oak. In the 51 minutes she had spent in the swamp on the morning of the first day, she had prepared not only for the hunt, but for what came after the hunt, for the walk north in the days that followed, through a country in which no one was any longer looking for her, because the whole of the county believed her to be, by then, dead in the swamp. She walked over the next 4 weeks 130 miles. She walked at night. She walked in the way her father Samuel had once taught her, by the moss on the north side of the cypress and the water oak. She ate the cornmeal in the second pouch, the pouch that did not have the mad root in it, and she ate the roots she had been taught to eat, and she drank the water she had been taught to drink. And on the 28th day of her walk, in the last week of November 1838, she came out of a stand of pine into the yard behind a small cabin on the north bank of the Big Black River, 70 miles above Vicksburg, and she knocked once on the door. The door was opened by a free black woman named Rachel Hicks, who was 51 years old, who had been born free in Ohio, who had come south in the 1820s in defiance of her own family to do the work she had come south to do, and who had, in her small cabin on the north bank of the Big Black, been the first Mississippi station on a route that ran quietly and by 4 separate hands all the way up through Tennessee and Kentucky into southern Indiana. Rachel Hicks did not ask Ruth Ellen who she was. Rachel Hicks did not ask Ruth Ellen where she had come from. Rachel Hicks looked at the small woman on her back step, 37 years old, in a dress that was in pieces, with her feet wrapped in rags and her hair caked with 3 weeks of swamp. And Rachel Hicks said one sentence. She said, "Come in, sister. You are safe here." Ruth Ellen came in. And now, because this is the part of the story that has been waiting for you since the very first minute, and because I promised you at the beginning of this hour that we would come to it, and because it is the reason her name still deserves, 188 years later, to be spoken out loud, I have to tell you about the boy. Isaac, her youngest son, 9 years old, the child she had left behind at Live Oak Plantation on the morning of the porch and the pocket watch. She had left him behind. She had left him behind on purpose, because she had understood in the long 36 hours she had sat on her mother's cabin floor after Sarah was sold that if she tried to take Isaac with her, that if she ran with a 9-year-old child through a swamp with 11 dogs behind her, she would not make it, and neither would he. She had understood that the only way she could save him in the end was to make the colonel and the county believe that she was dead, that she had gone into the swamp and never come out, that the woman who had once been the property of Live Oak Plantation was, at the bottom of some black pool somewhere north of the north fence, no longer anyone's business at all. And it had worked. It had all worked. The county believed she was dead. The colonel, in his broken years, believed she was dead. Believed it so fully that the belief itself was the thing that had, in the end, unmade him. And Isaac, small, quiet 9-year-old Isaac, had been left, in the wake of her disappearance, in the care of his grandmother Hagar in the kitchen at Live Oak, where the colonel, who never again sold another human being from that property, had let him stay. Ruth Ellen had left her only remaining child so that he would be allowed to live. She had walked into the swamp on the morning of the porch with the whole of her plan built around the one calculation that a mother makes when she has lost 2 children already, which is that she will do any conceivable thing and pay any conceivable price to keep the 3rd one breathing. She had known when she stepped off her mother's cabin floor after Sarah was sold that she would probably never see Isaac again. She had known it on the porch. She had known it in the swamp. She had known it every night of the 28 nights of her walk to Rachel Hicks's cabin. She had known it in Ohio, where Rachel's network moved her in the spring of 1839. She had known it in Cincinnati, where she worked as a cook for the next 19 years. She had known it in Canada, where she went after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and where she lived out the rest of her life in a small board house in the town of Chatham with 3 other women who had come north in the years before her. She had known it. She had chosen it. She had never, in any of the years that followed, seen her son again. Isaac lived. He stayed at Live Oak until 1863, when Union troops came through central Mississippi and the enslaved people of Live Oak walked off the property in a group of 41 and did not come back. He was 34 years old. He made his way north, first to Memphis, then to Cairo, then in the spring of 1865 to Cincinnati, because he had heard from an old woman in Memphis who had known Rachel Hicks that a woman named Ruth Ellen from Mississippi had once, 25 years earlier, come through a certain house on the north side of Cincinnati and had gone from there to Canada. He looked for her in Cincinnati, in Windsor, in Chatham. He found her. He found her in the spring of 1866 in a small board house on King Street in Chatham, Ontario. She was 65 years old. Her hair was entirely white. She had been, in the 28 years since she had walked out of the swamp, a cook and a laundress and, in her last 5 years, a woman who did nothing at all but sit on a small porch in the late afternoon and watch the light come down through the maples. He knocked on her door. She opened it. She did not recognize him. He was 37 years old, the same age she had been on the morning of the porch, and he was a grown black man in a black wool coat, and the last time she had seen him, he had been a 9-year-old boy in the yard behind her mother's cabin, and 28 years of Mississippi and Ohio and the war had put a different face on him than the face she had carried in her head all that time. He said, standing on her step, "Ma, it's Isaac. It's your Isaac." She did not for a long moment move. And then Ruth Ellen, who had not cried on any of the days her husband was sold, or on any of the days her children were sold, or on any of the nights of the swamp, or on any of the days of the long walk north, put both her hands over her face, and she sank down slowly to her knees on the boards of her own front step. And her son knelt down with her, and he put his arms around her, and he held his mother in the doorway of her small board house in a country she had walked to on her own 2 feet for a long time. He stayed with her for 11 years. He was with her in the spring of 1877, when she died in her own bed in that same small board house at the age of 76. Her last words, according to Isaac, who lived until 1911, and who told this story once, and only once, to a young black minister in Chatham in the winter of 1908, were spoken not in English, but in the 4 low notes of a tune her mother Hagar had taught her when she was 7. She hummed those notes at the end. Isaac hummed them back to her. She closed her eyes. She was buried in a small graveyard on the edge of Chatham, in soil that had never held her as property. Her stone is still there. If you go, you can find it. It says only, Ruth Ellen, 1801 to 1877. She walked out. That is what the swamp gave back. That is what it kept. It kept 3 white men of the 5 who rode into it. It kept a young man's whole idea of himself. It kept a trader's whole business. It kept a patroller's peace of mind. It kept a colonel's power and his sleep and his voice for the name of the woman he had, in the end, spent 11 years silently writing in the drawer of his own desk. It gave back a woman. It gave her back to a small board house on the north bank of a river she had never heard of. And from there, it gave her back to a life she made with her own hands, and to a country whose language she never fully learned, and to a graveyard in Ontario that has, for 149 years, held her name in a soil that no ledger anywhere ever wrote her into. And in the end, in the last spring of it, it gave her back her boy. If this story has stayed with you tonight, if the sound of a woman humming in a swamp has found its way in the last hour into some deep, quiet part of you, I want to ask you one small thing before you go. If you feel that this work of speaking these names out loud again, one at a time, in the dark, is work worth doing, you can send a super thanks on this video, and you can write your name and hers in the comment. Every super thanks is what lets me sit down alone for the many quiet weeks it takes to find one of these women in the small print of the old records and to write her back into the room with you. It is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the only thing that keeps this small channel doing what it does. So if the story moved you, send one and write her name beside your own. Ruth Ellen. And yours. Together in the comment. That is how I know she was heard. Close your eyes one last time. A porch in Mississippi. A gold pocket watch. A woman in a gray dress, 37 years old, barefoot on the packed dirt of a yard. 5 men laughing. 11 dogs in a pen. And the tree line at the edge of the north field where the plantation ground began to soften into swamp. She was not the largest name in the history of American slavery. She did not lead an army. She did not write a book. She was not, in her own lifetime, ever famous. She was one small woman in one small county on one moonless October night in 1838, who had been paying attention her whole life to a world that had refused to look at her, and who used what she had heard in the 51 minutes she was given to unmake the men who had thought they owned her. She walked into a swamp because the only child she had left could not walk with her. She walked out of it, on the other side of the country, because she had promised herself on her mother's cabin floor in the summer of 1838 that she was not going to die easy. And she was not going to die alone. And she was going to keep her one remaining piece of the world, a 9-year-old boy in a kitchen behind a big house, alive. She kept the promise. It cost her 28 years of not seeing him. And then, in the spring of a Canadian year, on a small front step in a small town, she got to see him again. Say her name one more time before you close this. Say it out loud if you can. Ruth Ellen. Because a name spoken by a stranger 188 years after the porch and the pocket watch is a small thing. And a swamp is a large thing. And the world she was born into was, in its full, unbroken cruelty, an unimaginably large thing. But the name is what we have. The name is what she left us. And if you want to keep walking with me through these forgotten corners of history, through the porches and the swamps and the small board houses on the far side of every impossible river, then stay a while. Subscribe. Turn on the bell. There are so many more names waiting in the dark. We are not done speaking them.